Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to do trees, and especially trees that grow in cities, because I think that's the most important project on my agenda today. And because on Saturday there's a meeting of the Pugwash group, which I belong to, and I'm making a pitch for Canada's Pugwash organization to take on the idea of promoting urban forestry as one of our big objectives. So I've invited some real foresters in who are going to help me sort out what people need to know in order to judge whether this is a reasonable proposal or not. So in a way, I've also invited all of the Canadian Pugwashites who want to join us and ask questions or argue with people if they have points of view. So I have some good foresters here today. In Toronto here, my dear friend Sandy Smith, who's a professor of forestry. At least we're dear friends in the sense that I use you all the time whenever I have an issue.
That's okay, Meta.
Sandy Smith, I appreciate that. And in Quebec is Michael Rosen, who is in a way retired as an arborist, but he spent many years as the president of Tree Canada, which is a very worthy organization. And in Guelph is Heather Shibley, who is a landscape architect and an ecologist, and she is an expert on Miyawaki forests. And since the wonderful thing that the Miyawaki people do best is by teaching people how to make wonderful forests in small pieces of land in the city, size of your bathroom, you can have a little forest. So I'm going to be drawing all of these people to give some reflections on the potential value to Canada of investing in a big project to try to encourage millions of us to go plant some trees, especially in the cities. So let me say where I'm coming from, because a few years ago I read an article. Everybody in the world read that article by an outfit, called Crowther Group in Switzerland, that went out and counted trees and by various methods, estimated that there are about 3 trillion trees on the planet today, and that we need about 1 more trillion in order to reduce global warming. Well, everybody got on the bandwagon, and indeed Canada promised to plant an additional 2 billion trees. Well, that sounds really impressive, but if you realize 1 trillion is 1,000 billion, and Canada is going to plant 2 billion, I'm sorry, 2 out of 1,000 is not all that impressive. But we're going to have to work hard to even make that commitment, because it's not happening. Now, the question is, where do you put all those trees? Is there room for an additional trillion trees? Well, the Crowther people said yes, but they were counting the idea of having them growing in the Arctic, which is a very bad idea, because we know that the growth of trees in the Arctic has a net warming effect rather than cooling effect on the planet, because of the albedo effect. That is, the trees are darker than the snow around them, and therefore they warm things. And also Crowther said, well, we're not counting the space in cities or the farms, because we got to leave agricultural land for farmers and city people to live. Well, that's a bad idea, in my opinion. That's just where we need to put trees, in the city, because trees need to be cared for a couple of years in order to have a good prospect of survival. And that means that people have to look after them if you really want to improve the survival rate of your trees. And you want to have trees where the people are. And besides, people need trees. And so we can do various things that use the agricultural land too, plant them around, all kinds of great ways of using farmland without depleting your agriculture. But the main thing that I think is, let's plant trees along the roads or anywhere where people go. And so that was my starting point. I started calculating, could we put 2 billion trees along in city areas where, the Crowther hadn't even counted? Well, I think we need them. Cities are heat traps, and we need to have trees that will actually help cool the cities. In fact, the reality is that the amount of CO2 that a brand new tree will capture is not very much within 20 years. It takes a while for these trees to be grown up. So the most important thing we do to improve the quality or the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere would be to save the trees that we already have, and big trees. And we want to do that for sure. But we also need to find ways of planting trees in cities, and I think. So it occurs to me that people need, in fact, I know that cities can be something like 10 degrees hotter than the countryside around them. So the trees can begin to cool the cities even before they actually do much for us in terms of sequestering carbon. So there's a lot of room in cities where we could plant trees. I think especially lawns. And there are parking places along, I would say, let's plant trees really along both sides of every street and every road in Canada, if we can. And we have to calculate how closely we can plant them together and so on. But in a few years, we're not going to want you're not going to want to have a car within 5 or 10 years, because there'll be electric driverless taxis that will come and pick you up and drop you off, but they don't park. So you don't need all those parking spots. There are something like 3 or 4 parking spots for every car in Canada, which is going to free up an awful lot of space if we put our minds to making sure that the law says we have to plant trees in them. So we could take these parking spots and turn them into forests. And for that, I think we want to ask somebody who knows how to make Miyawaki forests, because they're wonderful little a use of small space in cities. We could get high school kids to go out, and church groups and the yoga classes and all kinds of people to turn out. The government could say, okay, meet me at the corner of so-and-so on this at 10 o'clock, and we'll have spades and trees and water and all the things you need to plant trees. So expect to spend an afternoon planting trees. And I calculated just my own crazy estimates as a completely uninformed person. I figured out that we could probably plant about 1.5 billion trees this way, in addition to the ones that the government in Canada has promised to be planting in remote areas. They have a service that collects seeds, so we could get them to collect seeds and give it to us and figure out where we need to plant the right kind of trees and so on. This is not a radical idea, because I know that China did something like that with the Loess Plateau, which is a part of China that's home to 50 million people. And it's been done in many other places too. Stockholm planted 40,000 trees a few years ago, and they're doing fine, thank you very much. So this is my proposal that I want to get the Canadian Pugwash group to support, at least to support a study of the idea. And then we could do a real life cycle calculation of how many trees we can plant and how much CO2 we can sequester that way and so on. Sandy, why don't you start off?
I'm very supportive of planting trees. I work in forestry. I've always, for as long as I can remember, I've worked in forests. I started in the north in the boreal, spent 15, 20 years, and now I spent the last decades down here based in Toronto, but urban forest, Southern Ontario. And I'm the type of person who defines an urban forest as anything south of the French River, for those who are in Ontario. And I have lots of discussions, animated discussions about that, but I always have been supportive of planting trees. The problem is that we tend to get focused on the numbers. And I think that's, trees are so much more than the number. And, then we get into the semantics. Is an acorn actually a tree if it hasn't sprouted yet? And is a seedling a tree, or is it just the big old ones? So, trees, I think I'm going to step around this a little bit and say we need, as people, to develop a better relationship with trees, because I think despite being Canadians and thinking of ourselves as a forested nation, I think we tend to think of those trees as being somewhere else, someplace we go to the cottage or hiking and camping or Banff National Park. It's our vision, but I think we have a hard time actually relating to the everyday challenges of trees, there's huge benefits that, in the last 10, 20 years, it's been getting more clearly quantified, the ecosystem services. But people still, when I speak with them that aren't foresters, focus on the disservices about how they have to rake up the leaves and they have problems with the walnuts that drop and all these issues, which is about, it's just the relationship with nature, which we know is really important. So, I think my big point too is, yes, plant trees, but you do have to look after them. And it's not just the first couple of years. If you're in an urban environment, and I include agriculture in that urban environment because I think there's lots of opportunities there, but you do have to look after them. Anything in these intense areas, very concentrated. So I think there's lots of opportunity on private land, and I've been working with some corporations in the city in institutional lands. 60% of the urban forest is owned privately, whether it's by individuals in their backyards or institutions. And so I've been working with corporations to try and, think about better ways to plant trees. So yeah, I'm on board, Meta.
Terrific. Okay, Michael Rosen. We haven't really had much of a conversation about this yet. Is my proposal crazy?
That's a kind of a planted question. Get the pun? Anyways, Meta, you're first of all, I want to congratulate you on the. I've read most of the document you sent. I didn't read the whole thing, but first I looked at it and thought 36 pages. Wow, that's a lot of pages for me to read. But it's really well done and it's really interesting and the research is really good and I like the approach. It would appear that it does appear that we need a lot of trees in our cities. Like Sandy mentioned, we're blessed or not blessed, depending on how you look at it, with lots of trees outside of our city. And we're the forest nation, but we're not really a forest people. And we don't really, we kind of rely on that, like sort of, I spent a lot of my career as a forest. I'm trained as a forester as well as an arborist. So, a lot of the emphasis was, well, if you want forest, if you're in Toronto, go a couple hours out of town, you'll get all the forest you need, sort of thing. And then it became a trend recently, although it was reversed a bit with the pandemic, that people, people actually don't seek their forest experience from going to a big provincial or national park. Most of their forest experience is the ravine, or it's the backyard, or it's the line of trees on the street. So it's a very much, it's a nice thing that Canadians can think that they have all this forested area, but honestly, the number of people who actually venture out there is kind of limited. Although, honestly, that I think it was kind of pandemic I think it kind of changed that. I'm not really sure. All I know is that, Algonquin Park is putting all these limits on who can visit the park. And, some other parks are like that now too, which I find kind of curious. I didn't think the usership of those parks was that serious that they had to, well, the restrictions are more on the camping areas, I think, than anything else. But all this to say, I guess you have a point in that the cities matter with regards to trees. Unfortunately, and this is where we have to sort of, this is where the rubber hits the road sort of thing, is, our cities were not created with trees in mind at all. Like, they were created to facilitate the automobile. That's really where it comes. That's the bottom line. So everything we do with trees in a city now, it's a total retrofit. Okay. It's a big retrofit and it's really expensive and it's really, really logistically, it can be really, really difficult. So when I look at, I'll take Toronto, lots of Toronto, say you landed at Pearson and you look around at Pearson and I look at, it's like 89% hard surface. I look at all this horrible hard surface infrastructure that was created, not just for airplanes, but for automobiles. And I think my mind goes to, wouldn't this be nice with trees? The reality of trying to put the trees in that area is incredibly difficult. So, but we're not here to talk about what's difficult. We're here to talk about, what's possible. So I'm not going to dwell on that. It is, and maybe this is where Heather comes in. It is possible to plant trees in what we would call hard surfaces. It just takes the right type of tree and lots of work to prepare the land and that sort of thing. I don't know. I'd be interested in how Sandy feels about this, but the argument around carbon sequestration in urban areas was always a tough sell for me, actually, because well, first of all, the I don't know how you figure it, but the cost per kilogram of carbon that will be actually sequestered by the trees is really, really high. Like, honestly, if you're sequestering carbon with trees, there's better places in the city to do that, right? There's like tons of, and actually your paper talks about it, all this abandoned sort of highway land, although of course reforesting next to a highway is problematic. We use a lot of salts and a lot of, stuff that trees really, really don't like. So that's a whole other, but that can be done, I believe, easier, if you will, than trying to rip up Dixon Road to put in trees, that kind of thing. And then the other thing I'm just thinking of is that, so on one sense, if we're going to talk about carbon sequestration, the city is not the best way to do it. But I often talk like the argument that we use, I think a better argument to use in the cities is not one of purely obviously carbon sequestration, but all the other benefits that trees can give. So that's where, yes, trees will sequester carbon in a city. Sometimes they don't do it a lot because, the tree has a hard time, establishing itself and growing. And we all know these studies looking at what the average life of a city tree is, and it's so bad, it's really low, right? I don't know, it used to be 7 to 10 years sort of thing was the average life of an urban tree. So how much carbon can you really sequester within 7 or 10 years, in a city? So, but I think if the argument is around, the other benefits that are provided by urban trees in addition to carbon sequestration, I think that's a better sell, if you will. Does any of this help you at all, Meta?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole point of my proposal to Pugwash is that they study the issues and find out all the downsides and all the problems and what makes sense, and maybe some things don't make sense, and we just change the proposal accordingly. So for that, I need a lot of good advice, and I'll probably come back to you both, all of you. But let's get to Heather.
I agree fully with what Sandy and Michael are saying. There are issues in terms of where to place trees in urban settings because of utilities and problems with road salt and not enough soil volume for different areas and air pollution and all of that. But I guess, what we found, so I'm a landscape architect, terrestrial ecologist, and consulting arborist. And I think as an ecologist, why I find Miyawaki Forest, that method, so exciting is that it's looking at more of the community approach as opposed to individual trees. So it's a real shift away from kind of this legacy of colonial European landscape management practices, which is grass and an individual tree plunked kind of in between it, kind of hearkening back to the upper crust of Europe when North America was first colonized, right? I think that's totally antiquated. It's outdated, and it's not, it's just not in keeping with where we need to be right now, especially given climate change and also just the general disconnect that our culture is experiencing between people, but also especially between people and the land that we live on. So looking at a method of recognizing that trees, just like humans, are social creatures and evolved to live with other animals and plants. This kind of method of bringing, the ones that we've done in Ontario, we loosely follow the methods. So we don't call it Miyawaki Forest, we call them mini forests, just because there's some recommendations that come out of India that doesn't necessarily fit the Canadian context from our experience. But we do try to aim at putting an assemblage of species together that historically have evolved together. So it's recognizing those plant communities that we see when we're out inventorying remnant forests in Southern Ontario, Central Ontario, and Quebec. And it's about nurturing that soil, bringing that kind of back to life and recognizing that we're only seeing half of the action, if at most, above ground. Most of what's happening is below ground. So if you can bolster that and add health and diversity into that, there's a better fighting chance for this community to survive. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to include these kinds of plantings in traditionally forested landscapes. So I'm not proposing that we put these forests in Saskatchewan or other areas where it's really tall grass prairie and other types of ecosystems, but to fill up the landscape that's been kind of devoted to grass, right? So especially at these places where the only time anybody ever walks over the grass is to mow it, but it's not used for anything else. So what you were saying, using these empty kind of forgotten spaces in between highways or like along these smart center strip malls or the side churches, in the back end of the schoolyard, wherever there isn't active play or it's not being utilized for something else, we should really be filling it back with trees because that's what this landscape wants to revert to anyway. And I think, and then as an end to that, I would say too that we really need to get past this perception that our own personal properties are not part of the larger context, because your backyard and your front yard are part of this landscape. And so as stewards of the landscape, we should be really treating that in respect to other species. So by planting native species or species that can handle the kind of conditions that site offers. So I planted a mini forest in my backyard, and there's about close to 300 trees and shrubs, and I'm downtown Guelph, Ontario, so it's a pretty small plot. And then my front yard is, I have a Norway maple from the city, so I have a shade garden, and that I'm using as kind of I'm planting a lot of woodland species that can kind of handle the shade of a Norway maple, and I will use those genetics, those seeds, and populate my backyard once the seedlings in the back are big enough to support a shaded backyard. So I'm encouraging people to plant these in their backyards because you're not dealing with utilities and those kinds of issues in your backyard. And if you can in your front yard, go for it. But I think this landscape needs to be forested again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, now we have a couple of my friends here with us from the Pugwash group. And I want to make sure that they both have an opportunity to ask questions or introduce their own concerns. Robin Collins.
I would agree entirely that urban tree or urban afforestation or tree planting and so on is a good thing in and of itself. But I would also agree that it will not be a major sequestration solution. Just because of the scale. That doesn't mean that the project isn't worthy. But if the focus is on carbon sequestration, then other tree opportunities may be the ones to focus on. Michael's comment about the average life of an urban tree, 7 to 10 years or 12 years, whatever he said. That's news to me, but that's really interesting and important, I think. So that also feeds to where's the best dollar placed for afforestation and reforestation.
Thank you. Let me ask if Peter Mikey has an issue.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry my camera isn't working, so you'll have to put up with this talking black space. I guess the question of the rate of absorption and what happens with trees afterwards, etc. You know, there are always these concerns that people have had about using trees for removing carbon from the atmosphere. But I have a couple of other concerns. I have a lot of trees in my backyard, but I just lost a few of them during the last big storm we had. And when you look at the hurricanes and the effect of this tree, I mean, we have a law here in Ottawa that we can't even put a windmill in our backyard because of the problem of it falling over or something like that. And but we certainly have a lot of trees that have done a lot of damage to houses. And I guess that's one of my concerns. If we keep adding, maybe we've got the right, better trees to do this with. I'm fascinated by bamboo. And are there other types of trees that actually absorb carbon faster than maples or whatever that we normally have? And
I've heard of hemp. Does it hemp work?
Yeah, hemp and so on. The idea of using people to look after your trees, I think, is a great idea. I wonder if anybody would like to comment on this recent report concerning the federal government's analysis of the effect of trees. They claim that really that the forests are not doing the job that the federal government says it's doing.
I haven't read this report specifically, so I can't comment on it, but there's
I
a
haven't
lot
read
of,
the report either, and I've only read the news that came out this morning on it.
yeah, I think I don't know, Mike, you might know Werner Kurtz's stuff a little bit. I mean, it's not a simple, and this is what I found in forestry, it's really hard to make a complex topic simple. Trees, and to come back to carbon sequestration, like I do think they're important, and it'll vary. As any scientist, you'll say it depends on where they're growing and the species and age. And I think, Mike, I might say, just to respond to a little bit that Robin picked up on the age of an urban tree. I think that's older data that came from these trees that were put into planters on the streets, right? Like, so it's not your average urban tree. As I said, 60% of the trees are on private land, and it really is about root volume. And you can, if you look after your trees, you can have them reach a full size and live for a long time. I'm thinking of, in a way, sorry, Heather, I'm going to go to Europe, like where you look after trees in very urbanized areas through pollarding or other arboricultural systems. So you can get them to sequester carbon, but I guess for me as a forestry person, a professor, and someone who works in the area, I think it is about the multiple values. That it's the complexity of a tree that provides its great value. Yes, does it sequester carbon? Of course, but it also does all these other services that society in this time, in this place, really seems to need. And maybe to speak to Robin's point, like even just lecturing to students this morning, even just a relationship with people, with the land and nature, like. So I don't know, as I'm responding, I'm sure there's situations where our boreal forests are going to release more carbon than they sequester. That's the nature of the forest dynamics. But I don't see where that negates the need to, or the desire and the benefit of putting in more trees.
Mm-hmm. Well, at least we know that it does cool. When we are dealing with global warming, we're actually talking about how much comfort there is for people walking around in the cities. And these apparently trees can reduce the average temperature of a city by several degrees.
And 10 degrees probably,
10 degrees,
in the shade versus the sun. I've done this several times living downtown Spadina College, and it's 10 degrees cooler in the shade.
Which is worth a lot right there. That's true. And I have a question that the issue about the size of the trees. I'm arguing for urban trees, but at the same time, obviously, the important thing is to be able to sequester carbon too. And that needs to it means that we need to protect big trees. Now, what I'm wondering is, we see all these horror pictures of forests that have been chopped down, clear cut, and it breaks your heart. You see these gorgeous old stumps of trees that are 10 feet across in diameter, that the trees have been made into toilet paper or something. It's an egregious offense against everything that we should care about. But what I'm wondering is, can't they do a better job of removing dead trees from the forest? Because clearly, when a tree has lived its full life expectancy, then of course you want to take the wood and use it for something, especially if you can use it to store carbon indefinitely by making a building or furniture or something from it, so that it has use value and doesn't just get burned up and send the CO2 back to the atmosphere. Is there a better way of logging that doesn't do as much damage to the whole forest than what I've seen in these horror stories that I've been watching?
The forests are being logged according to a, quote, silvicultural system. And there are many silvicultural systems in place, and it's all dependent on the type of forest, the shade tolerance of the trees. In nature, many of these forests that are clear cut are actually shade intolerant trees, meaning that they are trees that in nature would have grown back after natural catastrophic events such as wildfire or insect infestation or wind throw events. So in a sense, and I know that it's not totally a copy, the clear cutting with standards and in small patches is an attempt, if you will, to imitate what nature would have done anyway. That being said, if you have a forest that's more of a what we're used to in the southern parts of, say, Ontario and Quebec, an all-aged forest, then obviously that type of silvicultural system does not make any sense, and you're forced to implement something that's more of an all-age system, which we would normally call a selection type system. And then for some species of trees, not maples and not beech, for instance, but more like your pines and your oaks, they are actually intermediate in tolerance. It's all about shade tolerance. And in those cases, there's another silvicultural system that's widely used, and it's called the shelterwood system, which resembles sort of something in between selection and clear cutting. So I guess the way I look at it, Meta, and is that it's better than it ever has been. The standards that are being applied now, remember, are all party to a lot of third-party certification. There's a number of systems that are set up, FSC and SFI and a CSA and a bunch of others, which actually apply standards to the way forests are managed and give these forests a certification. That's been a huge piece since the sort of 1990s type thing. And now a huge percentage of Canada's forests are subject to that third-party certification, if you will. So things that look bad to the human eye can actually just be, and I'm not excusing it, I'm just stating what's reality, can be a temporal disruption, if you will, and that in the long term, forests are dynamic and replace themselves accordingly. The argument around like clear cutting itself is, clear cutting is often equated to deforestation, but the two have actually nothing to do with each other, because clear cutting is actually a recognized silvicultural system that, when applied in the right way, will regenerate forests in perpetuity. In other words, clear-cut forests will actually develop back into forests. Deforestation is something we see when we actually change the land use. So urban areas that people live in, farmland, road construction, mining, that sort of thing is a conversion from what was previously a forested use to something else. And that is really true deforestation. So in fact, in Canada, the amount of land that's actually, quote, deforested is relatively small, and it's limited to, like I say, urbanization and agriculture and road construction, that sort of thing. Okay, But that being said, you mentioned one other thing about I think it was about dead trees, and that's an interesting one as well, because I do some work. I consult with residents and landowners on managing their woodlots and their forests. And one of the biggest mistakes, actually, a lot of people assume when they manage their forest is that they're going to cut the dead trees. That's a big piece of forest management that I'm forced to sort of point out is not actually the best management strategy, because there's actually more biological activity in a dead tree than a live one. As far as biota goes, as far as insect mass and bird production and all those sorts of measures, dead trees support much more biomass, much more biota than a live one. So in fact, it's a bit of a mistake to walk into a woodlot and cut all the dead trees. The dead trees should actually be left for, many of them should be left for wildlife. And it's really the live trees that warrant the cutting to manage properly, to let more light into the forest floor, to allow more age classes of trees to develop. Because, and that's part of a sustainably managed woodlot. Now, I'm not advocating that we do forest management on 100% of every forest everywhere. And besides, that'll never happen. That's not realistic. But for those people who want to manage for many purposes, one of these silvicultural systems should be implemented. Anyway.
Ouch, ouch, ouch.
I know.
Because it's really bothering me. What I know that is being reported as a fact is that there's still more reduction in forestry in the coverage of the canopy of forests in the world going on now than there is addition growth to this forest cover. So we have to actually, if we're focusing on CO2 removal, and we see trees as a mechanism of capturing and retaining carbon as long as they're alive, then clearly, if you go and do a clear cut, you're going to reduce the amount of CO2 being sequestered by those trees, especially the big trees. So you want to keep the big trees, and if you replace them, if you cut them all down and replace them with baby trees, it's going to be many years before they're able to sequester the amount of carbon that's there. And the other thing is, when a tree dies, that's exactly when it stops sequestering carbon, but starts rotting and restoring the CO2 back to the atmosphere. So I would have thought that that's when you want to cut the thing and use it for some permanent durable product like furniture or houses. If you're just thinking about the CO2 sequestration, the rest of your argument I can live with, but boy, it sure bothers me when I'm thinking about global warming, and because it doesn't sound like it's going to, this method of silviculture that you're promoting doesn't sound like it's going to do much for our warming issue.
Could I jump in just very quickly? I think what Mike's talking about, and it's kind of what we do right now and that's what forest management, even in clear cutting, is trees are cut at the peak growth. Like the growth is optimized. To come back to your argument, Meta, the amount of carbon being sequestered, when growth is optimized, the amount of carbon being sequestered is proportional. So you're at your optimal carbon sequestration when the tree is at its optimal growth. That is the window, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the specifics here, Mike, but that's when you actually do cut them. You don't want it to go into decline, and you don't want it to slow down in its growth, because that's when it's not growing and it's not sequestering carbon. So we actually, the forest management strategies, even for clear cutting, are always you cut the trees when they're sort of just at their prime or just going beyond it, so that you actually
that has to do with metabolism. Clearly a baby is metabolizing at a different rate than an old person, but right. The amount of carbon or material that's contained in a big thing is obviously going to be a lot more than is contained in a little thing.
So that's why you want to cut it. That's why you want to cut it at, I don't know, let's say jack pine at 80 years. Jack pine could live, how long does Jack pine live? Mike, it could live over 100, but you cut it at 80 because it's sort of like a mature adult. It stopped growing. It stopped, bringing carbon in. It's got lots of carbon stored. And that's exactly what you would do, is say, okay, this is when we take the carbon. It's been sequestered. Now we will put it into furniture. Toilet paper wouldn't be the best use, probably. We put it into buildings. We lock that carbon into place so it doesn't rot in the field. You know what I mean? Like,
And you plant, and you plant some more. That's the point.
yes, and you plant some more,
Right.
which will take some time, another 80
Right.
years to get to where it needs to be.
It's a
So
cycle.
it's exactly what we do.
But the minute you cut it down and replace that tree with a baby tree that's 2 feet tall,
Yeah.
you have reduced the amount of carbon being sequestered in the world by a huge amount.
Well,
No, because the if I'm not mistaken, others can correct. The elderly trees are potential carbon.
Emitters.
emitters,
produce-
they're releasing
That's
carbon.
right. They actually
Right.
release more carbon, so you want to get rid of the old ones. But you want to get them at their peak before they become problematic. So you
Right.
cut them down, can use that carbon that's been collected and locked in for useful purposes, and begin again with new trees that can now.
You mean to say that a big tree, like, a huge redwood or something, is emitting more carbon than it is containing?
It could be. It depends on what condition it's in. If it has a lot of decay and rot, if it's slowed down in growth, if it's broken branches and all sorts. There's some studies now going on in Halliburton Forest. We're looking at wood decay, and there's quite a bit being emitted by trees that are attacked by diseases and squirrels living in them. Every time there's a wound or something, that tree starts to emit. And the older it is, the more likely that's to be the case. It will start releasing carbon. At what point is the balance of storing and releasing? This is what you're asking about, Meta, is when does the balance happen? And that's usually, back to what foresters would say, optimal growth. Like you're still young and healthy and you're storing carbon. I mean, you might let it go a little longer, but there's some trade-off. I don't think we've ever looked at it that way. We usually the focus has been on volume of wood, which is seen to be, well, it's the volume of carbon. Wood is carbon. That's what you're trying to get. This is carbon, wood.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say though, the question is, how is that wood that's been harvested utilized? Because if it's used for burning,
Yes.
right, which is I think the
Right.
number one use right now. So it really is like the afterlife if you're concerned about carbon sequestration. The other thing I just want to throw in too is that trees are a lot more than just carbon sinks.
Mhm.
And so that we don't want to forget that, like, even though they might, that curve might switch at a certain point in their lives from collecting carbon to starting to release it, they're doing a lot of other things too. And we're not only in a climate crisis, we're in a biodiversity crisis.
Right.
So it's important to keep that in note too, that those heritage trees are very important.
Yeah, it's not an argument to cut down all the redwoods and the
Get rid of
Douglas.
the old trees, yeah.
Yeah. We want to keep this stuff for aesthetic reasons. I mean,
Yeah.
they're just sort of like, the ones that everybody looks at, but we're actually talking about, the boreal forest or the Amazon or like the major tundra in Russia, not tundra, but the taiga, I guess it's called it.
Yeah,
These are the
boreal.
major contributors of potential sort of sequesters of is that a sequester or sequestrationists?
Well, I guess they have great potential because of the area, the land base that they occupy, especially in North America, and I presume the same in Russia. There's potential of large areas of trees, but I mean, the Amazon should be the same. Why back to, I think Mike made this point, why we cut trees primarily. It's not about forestry. It's about agriculture. It's about clearing land. It's exactly what we did here when we came to Canada, let's say, or North America, first thing we did was start to clear the land. In fact, that's how you got your property as a pioneer here. You had to clear your land, or you didn't own your property. So the first thing you had to do was get rid of the trees so you could put your log cabin and start growing food and farming to support communities. That's what, back to the colonial establishment, that's what we're trying to do, take over the land. So
Well, it is
the boreal, like, it's the
looking at it
volume
that
of
way, though,
these trees.
Sandy, it does mean that we do need still a lot of land for agriculture. So the general net direction is there may be still be clearing land just in order to feed the growing human population, which means that if we want to keep the amount of trees even steady, much less growing in the world, if we really want to get an extra trillion trees, we've got to find someplace else to put them. And that needs to be, I think, in urban areas or along roads, in the countrysides and that sort of thing. I don't know where else you can do it, because the Crowther people were talking about planting it in the art, or not planting it, but expecting it to be these growths, these increases in the number of trees largely take place in the Arctic, which is a terrible idea. If anything,
No, they're not saying that, actually.
well, they did say they expected it to. They did not say they encouraged people to plant them, but they didn't caution people about the dangers of having trees in the Arctic. And that's there's this wonderful book called Tree Line, where a guy went around all around the North Pole and all the countries in the Arctic and looked at where the trees are growing, and it's really a very serious problem. Anyway, the thing is that if we want to have even keeping steady the number of trees that we have in the world, while we have to continue clearing land in order to make agricultural fields, then we have to put them in urban areas, or at least what you call urban, which most people would not call urban, that is along country roads and expressways and that sort of thing. Am I wrong?
No, you've brought it around really well, Meta, back to the urban. You've done a really good job at that, and you're absolutely correct. I think that's the way to go. There is also what I would call abandoned agricultural land, or marginal. It's abandoned for a reason. And actually, I think, I'm not an agrologist, but I think we're getting much better at our efficiencies in agriculture. So we actually, I don't know, I think we need less land because we're able to grow so much more food per hectare of land. So that means that anything, and I'm seeing this around where I live, I'm involved now in a project, it's a very small project owned by a land trust where near the Gatineau Park in Western Quebec, and it's a classic marginal agricultural land. It's not really that really productive. One field very sandy, one field very clay, and the owners decided to put it back into trees, and it's an amazing project. It's going to be so much more beneficial, I think, for the environment, and there's space for 10,000 trees, not according to maybe how Heatherwood planted, but anyways, it's lots. So I think there's a lot of marginal farmland as well. It's very interesting, I think, with the 2 billion tree program of the federal government, how difficult it actually is to find sites to plant trees. It's kind of ironic. We're sitting here thinking we need more trees. The government is actually giving people money to do that, and it's still having people are still having trouble coming up with sites to plant trees. It's kind of ironic. Anyway.
Well, I would have to take a little bit of issue with the question of whether or not we're getting better and better at farming, because I mean, certainly we're doing more and more industrial farming, but the overall effect is that we're depleting the soil worse than we ever were before. So that one of the other projects I'm promoting in this Pugwash thing is the idea of using soil amendments such as biochar and rock dust and seaweed extract, or whatever you call it, as a way of improving the productivity of the soil as well as sequestering carbon. But unless we do that, I think the overall net effect globally is that somebody wrote, and I don't know that I wouldn't say this is absolute gospel truth, but that we have something like 60 more crops in the soil now because it's all being washed away or depleted or otherwise ruined. The soil is being ruined unless we do something to restore its quality. And that's why I'm promoting the other thing. So I do think that we, by all means, we want to use a marginal land and improve it. And there are certainly ways of improving the soil with regenerative agriculture, which I think is an absolutely important thing as well. But I still think that this needs to be complemented by, and I don't think you've disagreed with me really, that it's not going to, we're not going to make all the difference up with urban forestry in terms of sequestering CO2, but we can make life much more habitable in cities by having cooler cities and better maintenance of the water in the soil and the health of the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, and there are a lot of health benefits and other benefits that come from having a lot of trees in cities. And I think I don't. Do any of you oppose the general idea of trying to find ways of improving the urban forestry in Canada?
I don't.
Are you against it? I want to hear it, but if so,
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
The question to me is not whether growing trees in urban settings or in suburbia or along highways is a bad thing. It's not. It's a good thing. For me, the question is, will it substantially contribute to the sequestration problem that will help resolve the carbon footprint? That's the question, and I don't think it will significantly, at least not urban. I think there are some other projects, saving the Amazon forest, and other. I mean, some have argued in 20 to 50 years the Earth will recover its own forests through simple biological succession on its own if we didn't get in the way of it. And there's pretty good evidence that that's a good process. That human planting is not necessarily the best way of doing it because for many reasons, let's not go into those. But I think there are places where human planting is absolutely useful at this point in time because we need to spur the reestablishment of forests, and sometimes you need human planting along the edges of even along Amazon forest destruction areas that you need human help to get that started back up again. But the urban forest project, as written, I believe is not a bad project. It's not a major or significant contributor to the sequestration issue, in my view.
Wait a minute. I thought this last sentence is
No, it's a good idea. It's a good idea on its own for other reasons,
okay.
but it's not. It's not going to contribute on the carbon front.
I agree.
Enough.
But I think in 50 years or so, when these trees grow, I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I'm stuck in this old model of thinking that
Not by numbers. I don't think so.
but a number of years, these trees will actually sequester more carbon than I think they will for the first few. I was looking for things that we can do within 5 years that'll make a difference. And you're absolutely right, that this plan will not increase the amount of carbon sequestration within 5 years, no matter what we do. It has other benefits that are really worthwhile, and eventually it will be helpful. Maybe not as helpful as we would like. And in fact, I'm sure it won't be as helpful as we need to have. So we have to use other methods. But
I don't know if you should. Sorry, I don't know if trees are going to solve the crisis. We're in a crisis. We're asking something that grows slowly to solve it for us. I mean, back to, I think Peter mentioned bamboo, etc. Like, I mean, if you really want carbon sequestration, you can move that into a model of you grow for that. It's no different than any other product that gets produced, and we kind of do that. The thing in Canada, we grow forests on the natural land base. But I came originally from agriculture. You kind of go, well, why aren't we like bamboo, grow it in plantations or poplar, grow it fast, cut it, store the wood, or lock it into biochar, like take the carbon. I think we're not very creative or innovative, and we're kind of locked into what we do. I mean, all the other benefits of forests, and back to Heather's, the diversity and the forest stands and all these other great benefits. I don't know as they'll come out of our plantation forests. I mean, people don't seem to like plantation forests, but hey, that's what we're doing to agriculture. So, I mean, I think it's being more honest, and it actually, if you want to grow trees for carbon, then you can do it. Can you solve the crisis? No, but it can't. It's certainly not going to hurt, and if anything, it will help.
Okay,
and if you don't plant it
yeah.
today, you won't have it in 80 years. So
suppose we try your thing of bamboo or hemp. I've heard hemp. I don't know that how well bamboo grows in Canada, but at any rate, where would we put bamboo forests? I mean,
yeah, I'm not advocating bamboo forests. Actually, it's a non-native plant.
Just
I don't really
stick
want
with poplars if you want to do that. And I wanted to say too is that there is no one magic bullet. We seem to be very attracted to these, like, oh, this is the solution that's going to solve all our problems. That's not the case. And there's not one move that's going to solve this. It's all the little things, just like how we're in this state because of 1,000 cuts that we have thrown at the systems that have been functioning on this planet, for millennia. So I think it's just recognizing that we all have a small contribution, and it's okay if your idea isn't going to be the panacea of getting past this climate crisis. The panacea, right? Like it's.
Yeah. Okay, well, we could have a whole conversation about whether we want to wait and see if everybody does things like turn off the lights and ride bicycles. I don't think, I think we have to look for things that have a lot of mileage. And I think trees are big enough in the effect in general for the quality of life and a bunch of other reasons, including, by the way, production of food. Because if we have a lot of fruit trees and nut trees in urban areas, that actually could help a lot. Not necessarily because Canadians are going hungry, but in a lot of countries it would make a difference. Anyway, I think, we do need to prioritize in terms of where we're going to put our main energy. And I have 4 things that I think are important enough to really focus on that will have an impact within 5 years. And I agree with you that urban forestry is not going to have an impact on sequestering carbon within 5 years, but it will make a difference a little bit in a few years, several years. And in the meantime, there are a lot of other benefits that will come for it. So I'm sticking by my original proposal.
So you should. Yeah.
Okay.
And I said I support it. I do. I mean, it's never wrong. It's never wrong to plant a tree. Will there be issues? Probably. And will it solve all your solution? No, it won't be all the solution to everything, but it's never wrong. And we will need those trees for something. I don't know what it is in the future we'll need them for, but we'll need them. And right now carbon is one of the pieces. I just think we lack creativity on how to do this. I mean,
let's think about what kinds of trees and where and how many we can do and all of that stuff. I'd like to get down eventually to some real specifics of what we can do, how much it's going to cost, and who's going to do the work, and how long they have to water the trees, and what about the bugs, and
you have to water them forever.
Practical questions, because getting from here to there is a big problem in terms of really logistics and practical things. So I'm probably going to get back to you with other questions if you all are willing to give it a little thought sometime. Thank you. Okay, blessings. Thank you very much. And goodbye. See you another time.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
I-
These conversations are produced by Project Save the World. This is episode number 514. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues. And to find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.